Monica Richardson stood in the cool hush of the airport terminal, her heels clicking steadily against the polished floor. She moved with practiced precision, suitcase in tow, her dark green blazer a subtle nod to both professionalism and personal style. She didn't rush, she never did. It wasn't her way. Instead, she allowed herself the rare luxury of savoring the moment. The legal victory she had secured earlier that week still lingered like a faint glow around her. 7 figures. A settlement that would change lives. It wasn't just a win, it was a reminder that the years of quiet persistence had been worth it. At the airline counter, she produced her ID with a small, polite smile. "I'd like to upgrade to first class," she said. The clerk, a young woman with a name tag that read Emily, glanced up briefly before resuming her work at the keyboard. "Let me see what's available," she replied in a tone that wasn't unfriendly but carried the efficiency of someone used to speaking without truly engaging. Monica watched the process with patient interest, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. It wasn't the first time she'd made such a request, but it was the first time in a long while she felt she truly deserved it. When Emily confirmed that one seat remained, Monica handed over her card without hesitation. For once, she wasn't thinking about budgets or cautionary tales from her mother about rainy days. Today, she allowed herself to simply enjoy. The security line moved at its usual pace, an assembly line of shoes off, laptops out, belts removed. Monica observed the scene with quiet detachment. A young family struggled with a toddler who kept removing his tiny sneakers. An elderly couple shuffled forward, the man carrying both their trays with a tenderness that softened the edges of the busy terminal. Once through, Monica treated herself to an overpriced cappuccino. Its foam artfully swirled into a heart. She carried the cup to a window seat near her gate, where she could watch the planes glide across the tarmac. They seemed almost serene against the chaos of the boarding area. She glanced at her phone, a habitual check, even though she had already silenced it. 3 messages from her assistant about next week's meetings. A note from her mother reminding her to pack something warm, though she was heading to Bali. And finally, a single emoji-laden text from Sarah, her best friend. "Get it, girl." Monica smiled faintly before switching her phone to airplane mode. The messages could wait. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the nagging pull of urgency. The boarding process was efficient, almost mechanical, but it held a quiet dignity she appreciated. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, a flight attendant greeted her with a practiced smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Richardson." The seat, a wide and plush cocoon by the window, felt both foreign and familiar. Monica slid into it, running her hand over the cool leather as though confirming its reality. She allowed herself a moment to take it in. The legroom. The quiet hum of subdued conversation. The faint scent of citrus from the cabin's air freshener. As she adjusted her belongings, she felt the weight of subtle glances from the other passengers. Not hostile, not overt, but present nonetheless. It was a look she knew well. A quiet questioning of how she had come to occupy this space. She let it roll off her, as she always did. Years of navigating similar moments had taught her how to hold herself just right to take up space without seeming confrontational. To exist without inviting scrutiny. The truth was simple but often unspoken. Monica was the kind of person who could afford this seat. But she was not the kind of person others expected to see in it. The hum of the engines grew louder as passengers continued to board. Monica accepted a pre-flight champagne with a quiet, "Thank you," savoring the bubbles as they tickled her nose. She didn't often indulge during the day, but this trip marked an exception in many ways. As she sipped, an older man walked past her row. His gait was steady, his suit impeccable, and his eyes glanced briefly in her direction before moving on. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Monica caught it. A flicker of confusion, followed by the kind of neutral expression people wear when they've just realized they've made an assumption. She thought of her younger self, of the girl who dreamed of places like this, who had pressed her nose to shop windows she couldn't afford to step into. That girl would have burned with shame under such a glance. But the woman Monica had become simply adjusted her blazer and turned her attention to the novel she had queued on her Kindle. Her fingers hovered over the screen, though, her mind unable to fully engage with the fictional world. Instead, She found herself thinking about the quiet patterns of everyday life, the rhythms that defined who belonged where and why. There was a soft brutality to these patterns. Not in their violence but in their consistency. The boarding announcement came for the final group of passengers. Monica leaned back in her seat, the champagne glass now resting empty on the tray. She had nearly forgotten about the world outside her own thoughts when she heard a voice behind her. Casual but commanding. "Oh, while you're up there," the man said, his tone indifferent. "Could you grab my bag too?" It took Monica a moment to realize he was speaking to her. When she turned, her eyes met those of a man in his 50s. His suit as sharp as his watch was expensive. He wasn't looking at her but at his phone, typing something with quick, practiced movements. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "What did you say?" "My bag," he repeated, gesturing vaguely toward the overhead bin. "The gray one. And I'll take a scotch when you get a chance." The words hung in the air, their weight heavier than they seemed. Monica felt her chest tighten, not with shock, but with something more familiar. A quiet, simmering exhaustion. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm not a flight attendant," she said evenly. "I'm a passenger, just like you." For a moment, the man looked confused, as though the words didn't quite register. Then his eyes flicked to her seat, and understanding dawned. His expression shifted to something like discomfort, though not quite apology. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat. "Of course. My mistake." Monica turned back to her book, the faint burn of the interaction lingering like a shadow. Around her, the cabin returned to its quiet murmur. Passengers pretending not to notice what had just happened. But they had noticed. They always did. She adjusted her Kindle, her fingers stilling over the screen. For a moment, she thought about saying more, about confronting the man with the full weight of her experience. But the plane had begun to taxi, and the safety announcements filled the air. There would be time, she thought. There was always time for moments like these. Moments that were small in the grand scheme of things but somehow carried the weight of a lifetime. The plane leveled off at cruising altitude, and a quiet settled over the first-class cabin. The flight attendants began their service with a practiced rhythm, their movements precise and unobtrusive. Monica Richardson adjusted her seat slightly, angling herself toward the window. Outside, the world was a canvas of endless sky and soft clouds, a serene contrast to the tension lingering in the air. She wasn't one to let things fester. But the earlier interaction with the man Robert Wallace, she had overheard his name in a passing introduction, stuck with her. His assumption had been so casual, so automatic, that it carried the weight of countless similar moments. Small, yes, but not insignificant. These were the moments that built up, layering over time like sediment, until they formed something heavy and immovable. Monica closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the engines wash over her. She could still feel the faint heat in her chest, that quiet mixture of disbelief and resignation. She had handled it, of course, as she always did, with calm professionalism, with a tone that suggested neither anger nor submission. But handling it didn't make it easier. It never did. Behind her, Robert's voice rose above the subdued conversations of the other passengers. He was speaking to the man beside him, his tone confident, almost boastful. "Private equity," he was saying, as though the mere phrase carried weight. "We manage over $2 billion in assets." Monica didn't turn around, but she could picture him, the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the quiet air of entitlement that often came with wealth. She had encountered his type before, in boardrooms, at depositions, even at charity galas. Men who didn't mean to offend, but who rarely considered the impact of their assumptions. Men who could afford not to. The flight attendant stopped by her seat with a second glass of champagne. Monica waved it off, asking instead for water. Her vacation hadn't even begun, and already she felt the familiar exhaustion creeping in. The murmur of conversation in the cabin ebbed and flowed like a tide, punctuated by the occasional clink of glasses or soft laughter. Monica focused on her Kindle, willing herself to sink into the light-hearted romance she'd chosen for the flight. But the words swam in front of her eyes, their meaning slipping away. She wasn't thinking about the protagonist's love triangle in the Maldives. She was thinking about Robert Wallace and the way his eyes had scanned her as though assessing whether she belonged. It wasn't just him, of course. It was never just one person or one moment. It was the security guard who had once stopped her in her own office building. The client who had asked to speak to the real lawyer. The partner who had suggested she soften her tone in emails so as not to come across as too assertive. Each moment had felt like a pebble, but together they formed a mountain she was always climbing. The quiet scrape of a seatbelt drew her attention. A young woman a few rows ahead had turned in her seat, her gaze flickering toward Monica. Their eyes met briefly, and the woman gave her a small, knowing smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A gesture of solidarity from someone who recognized the unspoken undercurrents of the moment. Later, when the flight attendant came by again, Monica found her voice. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Could you ask the gentleman behind me if he has a moment to talk?" The attendant, Karen, hesitated, her professional smile slipping just slightly. But then she nodded. "Of course, Miss Richardson." A few moments later, Monica heard the shuffle of movement behind her. She stood and turned to face Robert. Her expression composed, his brow furrowed in mild confusion. But he set aside the magazine he had been pretending to read. "Mr. Wallace," Monica began, her tone even, almost conversational. "I think we got off on the wrong foot earlier." Robert blinked, clearly unprepared for the directness of her approach. "Oh, yes," he said after a pause. "About that." She didn't let him finish. "I'm Monica Richardson," she continued, extending her hand, "senior partner at Marshall and Brooks Law." Robert hesitated, then shook her hand. His grip was firm, but she noticed the faint tremor in his fingers. "Robert Wallace," he said, his voice quieter now. "Apex Capital Partners." Monica offered a faint smile. "I specialize in corporate discrimination cases." "Fascinating work. Really. You'd be surprised how often small interactions like this one reveal much deeper biases in professional settings." She said it lightly, almost casually, but the meaning landed with precision. Around them, the other passengers had grown quieter, their movements slower as they strained to listen without appearing obvious. Robert cleared his throat, his discomfort palpable. "I didn't mean to," he began. But again, Monica cut him off. "Of course you didn't," she said, her tone still calm. "That's the thing about unconscious bias. It's not always intentional, but it has real consequences. It creates barriers for people like me in spaces like this." For a moment, Robert said nothing. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, defensiveness, guilt, perhaps even a flicker of understanding. Monica held his gaze, her own expression steady. She had no intention of embarrassing him. But neither would she let him walk away from this unscathed. When she returned to her seat, Monica felt a slight shift in the air. The tension hadn't dissipated entirely, but it had softened. Karen, the flight attendant, stopped by again, her voice quieter this time. "Miss Richardson," she said, leaning in slightly, "can I get you anything else?" Monica shook her head, offering a small smile. "No, thank you, I'm fine." But she wasn't. Not entirely. These moments were never fine. They were exhausting in a way that was hard to articulate, leaving behind a weight that lingered long after the confrontation was over. Still, she felt a quiet pride in how she had handled it. She hadn't raised her voice or lost her composure. She had simply spoken the truth and let it land where it would. Outside the window, the clouds stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their edges glowing faintly in the sunlight. Monica watched them for a while, letting their stillness calm her. The rest of the flight loomed ahead, long and uncertain, but for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet. Above the clouds, it was easy to believe in the possibility of change. The plane sailed smoothly through the open sky, the hum of the engines a steady background rhythm. Monica sat in her seat, hands folded loosely over her Kindle, though she hadn't turned the page in some time. Outside the window, the horizon stretched in shades of pale blue and white, an expanse that seemed endless yet distant. It mirrored how she felt, suspended between where she had been and where she was going. The interaction with Robert Wallace earlier still lingered in her thoughts. She had confronted him calmly, as she always did in moments like this, using words sharpened by years of legal training. Yet, as much as she wished it could be otherwise, these confrontations left a residue. They didn't slide away cleanly, no matter how polished her response. The weight of these moments was cumulative, each one layering over the last. Monica turned her attention to the cabin around her. The first-class passengers were quiet now, settling into the rhythm of the long flight. A businessman tapped away at his laptop, his screen glowing with spreadsheets. An older couple across the aisle whispered softly, their voices a soothing murmur. A flight attendant moved gracefully down the aisle, her presence unobtrusive but attentive. Life continued, the moment she had shared with Robert fading into the flow of the ordinary. Yet Monica knew that such moments rarely disappeared entirely. They lingered in the small shifts of expression, in the sidelong glances of those who had witnessed it. She had seen it many times before. The unspoken discomfort of people forced to examine assumptions they didn't even realize they carried. For some, those moments sparked reflection. For others, they settled like ripples on water, fading too quickly to leave a lasting impression. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me." The young woman from earlier, Lisa. She introduced herself, stood hesitantly in the aisle, clutching a tablet and a notebook. She gestured to the empty seat beside Monica. "Would you mind if I sit here for a minute?" Monica glanced at the open seat and nodded. "Of course." Lisa settled in, tucking her tablet into her lap. She looked nervous, her fingers twisting a silver ring on her thumb. After a pause, she spoke. "I just wanted to say, what you did earlier, that was something. The way you handled it." Lisa hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been in situations like that, but I never know what to say. I just get angry, or I shut down completely. But you," she exhaled. "You were calm, but firm." It was inspiring. Monica allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you. It's not always easy, but you learn. Over time, you figure out how to respond in a way that makes people listen." Lisa nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I work in tech," she said, her voice soft. "And it happens all the time. People assume I'm someone's assistant or that I'm in the wrong room. I know I should speak up, but it feels like every time I do, I'm risking my career." Monica understood that feeling, the weight of speaking up, knowing that the consequences could ripple in ways you couldn't predict. She had faced it countless times, especially early in her career. "It's not just about speaking up," Monica said. "It's about knowing when and how. Sometimes, the best response is the one that plants a seed, even if it doesn't bear fruit immediately." Lisa leaned back, her expression softening. "That makes sense. It's just exhausting. You know?" Monica nodded. "I do." The conversation shifted, becoming less about the earlier confrontation and more about shared experiences. Lisa described the subtle challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated field. The careful navigation required to balance ambition with likability. Monica listened, offering insights when asked, but mostly she let Lisa speak. Sometimes, she knew, people didn't need advice, they just needed to feel heard. As the flight attendants began their mid-flight service, another voice joined the conversation. "Mind if I add something?" The older man from across the aisle, David, leaned slightly into their row. His salt and pepper beard and weathered face gave him an air of quiet authority. He adjusted his tie before continuing. "I've been in business for 40 years, he said, his voice low but steady. "And I have to say, that exchange earlier, that was a master class in grace under pressure. I've seen situations like this before, but I've rarely seen them handled so effectively." Monica tilted her head slightly, acknowledging the compliment. "But," David added, "it shouldn't be on you to handle it. That's the part one struggle with. Why does it always fall on the person being underestimated to do the heavy lifting?" Monica met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Because if we don't, who will?" David nodded slowly, as though her words carried a weight he hadn't fully considered before. The conversation expanded, other passengers joining in small ways. A young man in a hoodie mentioned the challenges of working for a startup that prided itself on diversity but rarely promoted from within. An older woman, who had been pretending to nap, shared her experiences as a secretary in the 1970s. when inappropriate comments were routine, and speaking out often meant losing your job. Monica listened, contributing sparingly but thoughtfully. She recognized the threads that tied their stories together, the unspoken rules, the quiet assumptions, the invisible barriers. These conversations weren't rare, but they were rarely this open. Perhaps it was the altitude, or the temporary intimacy of being on a plane together. But something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just a discussion, it was an acknowledgement of shared struggles. A quiet understanding that these issues were both deeply personal and profoundly systemic. Later, as the cabin lights dimmed and the conversation waned, Monica returned to her seat by the window. Lisa thanked her before leaving, promising to follow up on their discussion. David gave her a respectful nod as he passed, his expression thoughtful. Monica leaned back, her gaze drifting to the darkened sky outside. The earlier tension in the cabin had softened, replaced by something quieter but no less significant. These moments didn't fix everything. She knew. They didn't erase the challenges she and others faced or guarantee that the next confrontation would be any easier. But they mattered. They planted seeds. And sometimes, Monica thought, seeds were enough. The clouds outside glowed faintly in the moonlight, their edges soft and blurred. Monica closed her eyes, letting the steady hum of the engines fill her ears. The flight would be long, but she felt lighter somehow, as though the weight of the earlier encounter had been shared, its burden distributed among those willing to carry it forward. In the quiet stillness of the cabin, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The soft glow of the cabin lights illuminated Monica's face as she sat quietly, hands folded in her lap. The flight had settled into its long, steady rhythm, with most passengers either lost in movies, engrossed in their work, or dozing lightly. She wasn't tired, though. Her mind was too restless, replaying the moments from earlier in the flight. Her exchange with Robert Wallace hadn't been dramatic, nor had it been loud. It hadn't needed to be. The weight of it came from its quiet inevitability. Moments like that were as much a part of her life as her morning coffee or the steady click of her heels on a courtroom floor. Each time, it was the same calculation: whether to speak up, how much to say, and when to let it go. Tonight, she had chosen to speak. But even now, she wondered about the ripple effects of her choice. What, if anything, would Robert take away from their conversation? Would it linger for him as it lingered for her? Or would it fade into the white noise of his day-to-day life, forgotten by the time the plane landed? She glanced out the window at the darkness beyond. The clouds were invisible now, the horizon indistinguishable from the sky. It was a kind of emptiness that felt oddly peaceful, a brief pause from the chaos of the world below. Monica reached for her bag, pulling out a slim leather journal. It wasn't something she used often, but moments like this called for reflection. She opened it to a blank page and wrote at the top, "Small moments, big impacts." Her pen hovered over the page, then began to move in slow, deliberate strokes. Why does it always feel like these moments cost so much more than they should? She wrote. The energy it takes to respond with grace. The patience required to explain. The composure needed to avoid being labeled angry or difficult. It's not the confrontation itself that drains me, it's the knowledge that it will happen again and again. She paused, tapping the pen against her chin. The truth was, despite the exhaustion, she didn't regret speaking up. If anything, she felt it had been necessary not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been in her position. It wasn't about changing Robert's mind in an instant, it was about planting a seed, however small, in the hope that it might grow. The quiet rustle of movement drew her attention. A flight attendant, Karen, appeared at her side. "Miss Richardson," she said softly, her tone gentle but curious. "I just wanted to thank you for how you handled things earlier. It's not often we see someone address those situations so directly but with such professionalism." Monica gave a small smile. "Thank you. It's not easy, but sometimes it feels necessary." Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You made an impression. I've noticed a shift in the cabin since then. People seem more aware. I think more considerate." Monica wasn't sure if that was true or if Karen was simply trying to reassure her. Either way, she appreciated the gesture. "Awareness is a start," she said, her voice quiet. But it's not enough on its own. It has to lead somewhere. Karen tilted her head. Considering that, well, if it helps. I've been thinking about my own assumptions since it happened. So, thank you for that. The attendant moved on, leaving Monica with a sense of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later, Robert Wallace himself approached. His steps were hesitant, his expression carefully neutral. Monica looked up as he stopped beside her row, his hands tucked into his pockets. Miss Richardson, he began, clearing his throat. I wanted to say, I've been thinking about our conversation. And I realize I owe you more than just an apology. I need to do better, be better. Monica studied him for a moment, gauging his sincerity. There was no grand gesture in his words. No dramatic flourish. Just a man who seemed, at least for now, genuinely uncomfortable with himself. I appreciate that, she said finally. It's not about being perfect, Mr. Wallace. It's about being aware, about choosing to see things differently. Robert nodded slowly. I was wondering. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to her. Your firm, do you offer any kind of training on this? On addressing biases in the workplace? My company could probably use it. Monica accepted the card, her expression unreadable. We do, she said simply. I'll have someone from my team follow up. As he walked away, she felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph, this wasn't that kind of victory. But it was a start. And sometimes, starts were all you could hope for. The rest of the flight passed quietly. Monica returned to her journal, making notes about the possibilities of corporate training programs, about the ways small interactions could become catalysts for larger change. Her mind turned to her colleagues back at the firm, particularly the younger associates who often came to her for guidance. Perhaps this moment could be more than just a lesson for Robert. Perhaps it could be a turning point for her firm as well. By the time the plane began its descent, Monica felt a sense of clarity. The conversation with Robert, the quiet support from Karen, even the brief exchange with Lisa, all of it added up to something meaningful. It wasn't just about responding to one man's assumptions, it was about creating a ripple effect. However small, that might extend beyond this flight. As the wheels touched down, she closed her journal and slipped it back into her bag. The sky outside was lightening now, the first hints of dawn breaking through the horizon. Monica sat back, her gaze steady, her resolve firm. Change, she knew, didn't come all at once. It came in moments, quiet, ordinary, often overlooked. But it came, and that was enough. Monica sat in her corner office, the quiet hum of the city a faint backdrop behind the glass. The view stretched across a patchwork of steel and concrete, each building a reflection of the industry and ambition pulsing through downtown. Yet, as she leaned back in her chair, her thoughts were not on the cases awaiting her attention or the emails blinking on her screen. Instead, her mind returned to the flight, to the conversation with Robert Wallace, and the unexpected opportunity it had sparked. The business card he had handed her was still on her desk, its sharp edges catching the light. She had followed up with his firm, and the interest had been immediate. Apex Capital Partners wanted to discuss a partnership, a series of corporate training programs focused on addressing unconscious bias. It was, she realized, an irony almost too perfect. The man who had once questioned her belonging in first class now eager to work with her to fix the very assumptions that had driven his mistake. But Monica wasn't one to dwell on irony. She was focused on what could come next. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Tanya, a junior associate, stepped into the office, clutching a notebook and looking equal parts excited and nervous. Monica gestured for her to sit. Good timing, Monica said. I was just thinking about a new initiative, and I'd like your input. Tanya's eyes widened slightly as she sat, clearly surprised. Of course. What's the idea? Monica picked up the business card and held it between her fingers. Apex Capital wants us to design a bias training program for their leadership. But I'm thinking this could be bigger, something we implement here at the firm. Not just training sessions, but real structural changes, clear mentorship pathways, accountability metrics, and support networks for underrepresented groups. Something actionable. Tanya's face lit up, her nervousness giving way to enthusiasm. That sounds incredible. Honestly, it's something we've needed for a long time. Monica nodded, her tone steady. It won't be easy. Programs like this often face resistance. People question their necessity or their cost. But if we want to lead by example, we can't avoid the hard conversations. Tanya hesitated, then spoke, her voice quieter. It's funny you mention resistance. I had a situation last week during a client meeting. They kept directing questions to my male colleague, even though I was the one leading the case. Monica's gaze softened. And how did you handle it? I tried to redirect, but it felt like I was talking over them just to get their attention. It wasn't until my colleague stepped in and said, "Tanya's the expert here," that they actually listened. Monica leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. It's a common dynamic, and that's exactly why this kind of initiative matters. It's not just about training people to recognize bias, it's about creating environments where those biases can't take root. Tanya nodded, her expression thoughtful. If you're putting together a team for this, I'd love to help. Good, Monica said, because we're going to need as many voices as possible. The rest of the day unfolded in a quiet flurry of activity. Monica drafted an initial proposal for the initiative, outlining the key components: mentorship programs designed to uplift junior employees, workshops that went beyond surface-level discussions of bias, and measurable goals for creating a more equitable workplace. As she worked, she found herself reflecting on her own journey, the mentors who had guided her, the barriers she had navigated, and the moments, like the one on the flight, that had fueled her resolve. By late afternoon, word of the proposal had spread. A small group of associates had gathered in her office, each bringing their own ideas and experiences to the table. Lauren, a third-year associate, suggested a reporting system to track subtle patterns of exclusion. James, a senior associate, spoke about the importance of allyship and how small acts of solidarity could shift workplace culture. The atmosphere was collaborative, almost hopeful, as if the weight of their shared frustrations was being lifted, piece by piece, through action. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Monica stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. The proposal was taking shape, but she knew this was only the beginning. Change, real change, required more than ideas. It required persistence, resilience, and the willingness to face discomfort. Her thoughts returned to the older passengers from the flight, to David's quiet acknowledgement of the burden she carried, and Lisa's eagerness to learn. They were reminders that change wasn't just about policies or programs. It was about people, about planting seeds in the minds of those willing to listen and watching those seeds grow. Tanya approached the window, her voice breaking the silence. Do you think they'll go for it? Monica turned to her, her expression calm but resolute. Some will, some won't, but that's not the point. The point is to start. Tanya nodded, her shoulders straightening. Then let's make it happen. As Monica watched her team leave, their excitement palpable, she felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. The journey ahead would be long, and there would be resistance. But for the first time in a while, she felt a spark of hope. The work wasn't just about responding to moments like the one on the flight, it was about transforming them into opportunities for growth. It was about creating spaces where the next generation wouldn't have to fight quite so hard to prove they belonged. And that, Monica thought, was worth every effort. The conference room was quiet but charged with a subtle tension. Monica sat at the head of the long, polished table, her notes neatly arranged before her. Around her, the senior partners of Marshall and Brooks exchanged glances, their expressions carefully measured. They weren't dismissive, not yet, but Monica could feel the undercurrent of skepticism in the room. She had seen this before, the polite nods, the thin smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. They weren't hostile, but they were cautious. Change, after all, was rarely welcomed with open arms, especially in institutions built on tradition. Monica glanced at the clock, then back at the faces around her. She adjusted her blazer, took a steadying breath, and began. Thank you all for making time today, she said, her voice calm but firm. I know this isn't our usual kind of proposal, but I believe it's one we need to consider seriously. She clicked the remote in her hand, and a slide appeared on the screen behind her. The title was simple: building an inclusive future. Beneath it, bullet points outlined the key components of her initiative: mentorship programs, unconscious bias training, accountability metrics, and transparent promotion pathways. This isn't just about diversity, Monica continued. It's about equity. It's about creating an environment where every member of this firm has an equal opportunity to succeed. One of the senior partners, a gray-haired man named Richard, leaned back in his chair. We already have diversity initiatives in place, he said. How is this different? Monica met his gaze evenly. What we have now focuses on recruitment. It's a good start, but it doesn't address retention or advancement. The reality is, we're losing talented people because they don't see a future for themselves here. This initiative would change that. Richard frowned slightly, but he didn't interrupt again. The next slide showed statistics. The firm's demographic breakdown by role. The stark drop-off in representation at the senior level. Monica had combed through years of data to prepare for this meeting, knowing that numbers often spoke louder than anecdotes. These aren't just statistics, she said, her voice softening. These are people, and they're telling us, in one way or another, that we need to do better. A younger partner, Lisa Chen, leaned forward. You mentioned accountability metrics. How would those work? Monica clicked to the next slide. We'd track not just promotions and raises but also more subtle indicators. Who gets assigned high-profile cases? Who's invited to client meetings? Who's given leadership opportunities? Patterns emerge when you look closely, and those patterns can guide us in making fairer decisions. Lisa nodded thoughtfully, but Monica could see Richard's skepticism lingering. And how much is this going to cost? He asked. We're a business, Monica, not a charity. Monica held his gaze. It's an investment, not an expense. Studies have shown that inclusive workplaces are more productive and more profitable. Beyond that, it's about our reputation. Clients are paying attention to these issues. Apex Capital, for example, has already expressed interest in working with us, but only if we can demonstrate our commitment to equity. That last point seemed to land. Richard's frown deepened, but he didn't argue. After the presentation, the room fell into a heavy silence. Monica waited, her hands resting calmly on the table, her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power, forcing others to fill the void. Finally, Lisa spoke. I think Monica's right. This is about more than numbers, it's about culture. And if we don't lead on this, we're going to fall behind. A few other partners murmured in agreement. Richard remained quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. Monica didn't press him. She had learned to recognize when people needed time to process, to grapple with the uncomfortable truths she had laid out. Change didn't happen in a single meeting. It happened in moments like these, where resistance met persistence. Later, as the partners filed out of the room, Lisa lingered. She approached Monica with a small smile. That was impressive, she said. I think you've got more support than you realize. Monica nodded, though her expression remained measured. We'll see. These things take time. Lisa hesitated, then added, for what it's worth, I'm glad you're pushing for this. It's overdue. Thank you, Monica said simply. I'm glad to have your support. As Monica returned to her office, she felt the weight of the meeting settle on her shoulders. It had gone well, better than she had expected, but she knew the real work was just beginning. Drafting policies, gathering support, navigating the inevitable pushback. It would be a long road. She sat at her desk, staring out the window at the city below. The sunlight glinted off the glass towers, each one a symbol of ambition, success, and the barriers that still existed for so many. Her phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Tanya. Great job today. Let me know how I can help. Monica smiled faintly, typing back a quick reply. Thanks. We'll need all hands on deck for this one. She set the phone down and turned her attention to the next steps. The proposal was just the beginning. There were emails to send, meetings to schedule, and plans to refine. As the afternoon stretched into evening, Monica allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. The flight, the conversation with Robert, the energy it had taken to respond, none of it had been easy. But it had led to this. To an opportunity to create real, Lasting change. She thought about the older passengers from the flight. About David's question. Why does it always fall on you? She didn't have an answer. But as she looked at the outline of her proposal, at the names of the colleagues who had already offered their support, she felt a quiet certainty. The burden wasn't hers alone. And if she could carry it just a little farther, she could make the path easier for those who came after her. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Monica felt something close to hope. The conference room buzzed with quiet energy. Monica stood off to the side, her notebook in hand, watching as attendees filed in. This wasn't just another firm meeting or client pitch. This was different. Senior leaders, junior associates, and even administrative staff had gathered to hear about the initiative that had grown from an idea to something much larger. A comprehensive program to address equity, inclusion, and bias within their firm. Monica adjusted her blazer and glanced at the agenda she had meticulously prepared. It felt surreal, almost, to see how far things had come. Just 6 months ago, the seeds of this program had been planted in the most unexpected place, a first-class cabin thousands of feet in the air. Now, those seeds were beginning to sprout. The presentation began smoothly. Monica spoke with the calm confidence she had honed over years of navigating high-stakes situations. She outlined the changes the firm was already implementing: mentorship programs pairing junior associates with senior partners, bias training that went beyond surface-level awareness, and new accountability measures to ensure transparency in promotions and case assignments. These changes aren't just about doing the right thing, she said, her voice steady but firm. They're about creating a stronger, more unified firm, a place where talent can thrive, free from the barriers of bias, whether intentional or unconscious. The room was quiet as her words settled, but Monica could sense the shift in the air. People were listening, not just hearing her. They were considering the possibility that this wasn't just a policy change but a cultural one. As the presentation ended, Monica opened the floor for questions. Lisa Chen, the partner who had supported her from the beginning, was the first to speak. This is impressive, Monica, Lisa said. But what do you say to those who worry this might create more division than unity? Some might see these measures as singling out certain groups. It was a question Monica had anticipated, and she nodded thoughtfully before responding. Change can feel uncomfortable, especially at first, she said. But this isn't about singling anyone out. It's about leveling the playing field, ensuring that everyone has the same opportunities to succeed. If we approach this with transparency and an open mind, it becomes a collective effort, not a divisive one. Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. Others chimed in, their questions ranging from logistical concerns to expressions of support. The discussion was robust but respectful, a sign that the firm was ready to engage with the complexities of the issue rather than shy away from them. Later, as the room began to clear, Tanya approached Monica with a wide smile. That was incredible, she said. I think you won them over. Monica smiled faintly, her expression measured. It's a start. There's still a lot of work to do. But it feels different this time, Tanya said, her voice earnest, like something real is happening. Monica nodded. She felt it too, a quiet sense of momentum, like the current of a river picking up speed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. In the weeks that followed, the changes began to take root. The mentorship program launched with immediate success, pairing younger associates like Tanya with seasoned partners who could guide their careers. Workshops on unconscious bias sparked difficult but necessary conversations. And for the first time, Monica saw colleagues acknowledging the subtle ways inequity had shaped their workplace. But the most significant change was harder to measure. It was in the way people interacted, in the quiet nods of understanding during meetings, the deliberate efforts to include voices that had often been overlooked. It was in the way colleagues began to see one another not just as coworkers but as people, each with their own struggles and strengths. One afternoon, Monica received an email from Robert Wallace. His firm had completed the first round of bias training, and the results, he wrote, were already evident. He thanked her for her guidance and mentioned that Apex Capital was considering making the program a permanent part of their leadership development strategy. Monica read the email twice. her lips curving into a small smile. It wasn't often that moments of confrontation led to moments of collaboration. But this one had. She forwarded the email to Lisa Chen with a simple note. Proof that change is possible. On a quiet Friday evening, Monica found herself back at her desk, reviewing the latest reports on the initiative's progress. The data showed improvement, small but meaningful gains in retention and representation at the firm's higher levels. But more than the numbers, it was the stories that stayed with her. Tanya winning her first major case as lead counsel. James feeling confident enough to challenge a partner's outdated assumptions. Lisa spearheading her own diversity efforts. These were the ripples of impact she had hoped for. As the office emptied for the weekend, Monica remained, her gaze drifting to the city outside her window. The skyline was bathed in golden light, the buildings casting long shadows over the streets below. She thought about the flight that had started it all, the tension, the quiet confrontation, the unexpected conversations that had followed. It hadn't felt like a turning point at the time. But in hindsight, it had been exactly that. Small moments, she realized, could lead to big changes. Not all at once, and not without resistance, but steadily, like a river carving its path through stone. Monica leaned back in her chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. The work was far from over. But for the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the progress that had been made. Above the hum of the city, she felt a deep, steady hope for what had already changed and for all the possibilities that lay ahead. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet. Its engines a quiet hum that matched the steady rhythm of Monica's thoughts. She sat in the first-class cabin, her notebook open on the tray table before her. Outside the window, the endless blue sky stretched to meet the curve of the earth. The scene was tranquil, almost meditative, a stark contrast to the complexities swirling in her mind. This flight wasn't like the one that had started it all. There was no confrontation, no tense exchange of words. But as Monica sipped her coffee and flipped through her notes for her keynote speech, she couldn't help but feel the echoes of that moment. It had been a small thing. Really just a casual assumption. A misplaced word. And yet, its ripple effects had grown into something far greater. She closed her notebook, leaning back in her seat. It had been over a year since that flight. And the world felt different. Though not entirely changed, her firm's equity initiative was thriving. With new mentorship programs, bias training, and accountability measures that were already yielding results. Clients had taken notice, including Robert Wallace's firm, which had fully embraced the training Monica's team had developed. The work had been hard, exhausting, even, but it had also been deeply rewarding. As the flight attendant passed by, Monica noticed the young woman sitting across the aisle. She was black, dressed in a crisp business suit, and her gaze was fixed on the screen of her laptop. She had the same look Monica had seen in herself years ago, focused, determined, but carrying an invisible weight. It was the weight of knowing you were often the only one like you in the room. The quiet calculation required to navigate spaces where you weren't always seen as belonging. Monica hesitated for a moment, then reached into her bag. She pulled out one of her business cards and leaned slightly toward the woman. "Excuse me," Monica said, her voice low and warm. The woman looked up, startled, but curious. Monica held out the card. "If you ever need mentorship or guidance, give me a call. I'd be happy to help." The woman took the card, her expression shifting from surprise to gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've read about your firm. The work you're doing, it's inspiring." Monica smiled, her heart lifting slightly. "I've had a lot of help along the way," she said. "It's only right to pay it forward." The plane began its descent, the captain's voice breaking through the hum of the engines to announce their arrival. Monica packed away her notebook and leaned back in her seat, watching as the clouds parted to reveal the city below. The streets looked impossibly small from this height, a patchwork of light and shadow. She thought about all the people down there, each one moving through their own struggles, carrying their own stories. The work she had done, the changes she had fought for, wouldn't solve everything. Racism and bias were too deeply rooted to be undone in a year, or even a lifetime, but they could be chipped away at, piece by piece, until the edges began to fray. At the baggage claim, Monica saw the young woman from the plane again. This time, she was standing with a colleague, laughing softly as they waited for their luggage. Monica didn't interrupt, but she watched for a moment, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. She had no way of knowing if the woman would ever call her. But that wasn't the point. The point was that the offer had been made, that the connection, however brief, had been extended. Monica turned and walked toward the exit, the wheels of her suitcase clicking softly against the tile floor. The air outside was warm, the sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of her hotel, settling into the back seat as the city blurred past the window. As the cab pulled up to her destination, Monica thought about the speech she would give tomorrow. It would be to a room full of business leaders and policymakers, all eager to learn about the changes her firm had implemented. She would talk about mentorship and metrics, about culture shifts and accountability. But what she really wanted to convey was something deeper, something quieter. She wanted to talk about the power of small moments, about how a single conversation, a single choice, could set off ripples that stretched farther than you could imagine, about how change wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes, it was as simple as offering a hand, opening a door, or speaking a truth that others were afraid to name. That night, as Monica sat in her hotel room, she wrote the final lines of her speech. Change is slow. It is often invisible, happening in ways we don't immediately see. But it is real, and it starts with us, with our willingness to question, to listen, and to act, not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, everyday moments that shape the world around us. She closed her laptop and sat in the silence for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle. Then she turned off the light and climbed into bed, the sound of the city outside her window a gentle reminder of the work still to be done. Above all else, she felt hope not for immediate transformation, but for the quiet certainty that the ripples she had started would continue to grow long after she was gone.